The world's poorest are bearing the brunt of the global refugee crisis, hosting almost 90% of all displaced people. And some of the wealthiest, the richest governments shirking their responsibilities to the world's neediest. This is Roundtable with me, David Foster. One example, the cap on asylum seekers allowed to enter the US is at its lowest level since 1980. A two-year program in Europe has relocated less than a fifth of the 160,000 asylum seekers it was intended to. So with the global refugee crisis, or at least the numbers at its worst level since the Second World War of the world's richest, are they failing in their responsibilities to provide what is actually called safe refuge?
A global crisis that's reached unprecedented levels.
We are facing the biggest refugee and displacement crisis of our time.
I want it for my kids to go to school. It's a simple right, yeah?
We repeat it once again. Global population movement have to be addressed.
Across the globe, 65 million people have been forced from their homes. Every minute, another 24 people are displaced.
I'm concerned that European countries are now adopting increasingly restrictive immigration and refugee policies.
Already America declared that they will not allow any refugee in Middle East.
While the focus of late has been on the crisis of Europe's borders, what of the refugee crisis around the rest of the world? And as the number of displaced grows, is the world's wealthiest shutting out those most in need of help? Uganda, home to the world's largest refugee camp. It has taken in 940,000 people fleeing the conflict in South Sudan. In neighbouring Kenya, the Dadaab camp is home to 240,000 refugees. Turkey hosts 2.9 million people, the largest number of refugees worldwide. At the end of 2016, Turkey, Pakistan and Lebanon hosted the most refugees. Pakistan is home to over 1.5 million displaced people, most of whom are from Afghanistan. And 1 in 6 people in Lebanon is a refugee. That's proportionally higher than any country in the world. In Europe, Germany took in the most refugees at the peak of the European migrant crisis. At the end of 2016, it stood at 670,000. The UK says it will take in 20,000 Syrians from refugee camps by 2020.
We cannot ignore this challenge or allow it to continue unmanaged. We need to do better.
Last week, US President Donald Trump reduced the quota of refugees that America will take to just 45,000. And there's growing resentment towards those seeking a better life in Europe, as far-right parties have grown in the wake of the influx of refugees.
I am alarmed, again, about growing xenophobia here and beyond. Divisiveness and marginalization hurt individuals and undermine security.
In recent weeks, Bangladesh has seen a massive influx of Rohingya fleeing persecution. In little more than a month, more than 400,000 people have crossed the border from Myanmar. And with no end in sight, many doubt whether the Rohingya will ever be able to return. But who is responsible for those displaced by conflict and war? Are Western countries pulling up the drawbridge on the world's refugees? Sometimes those that are displaced are as a result of Western intervention. With growing instability in the world, should humanity take precedence over man-made borders?
Well, we'll be going into some of that at today's Roundtable. Sarah Singer, a lecturer in refugee law from the University of London. Next to her, Ahmed Al-Rashid, a consultant with the International Organization for Migration, himself a Syrian Kurdish refugee. To my left, Jag Tagum-Chal, the research executive of the campaign group Get Britain Out. And also here, Ludovica Lacino, a reporter with the International Business Times who's been to the refugee camp that we mentioned in that report, biddy, so we'll ask you about that in just a moment, Ludovica. But Jack, you first of all, you're 22 years old, you have no dependents, but imagine you wake up in Bidi or Dadaab, you've seen your family slaughtered in a neighbouring country, South Sudan, you don't know what the future holds for you. Where do you look to for hope?
Well, the first thing, of course, is I would hope that my home country in the future would be a safe place that I can return to. That would be what you'd hope for in the long term. But in the short term, I would undoubtedly be trying to get to Europe and the rich Western countries. Undoubtedly, I would be looking for a better future. I would never deny that.
So you can't blame anybody in that situation for trying to get out of those countries and putting what you consider to be a burden, in particular, on Europe?
No, of course not. That is if you have no hope, you've had everything taken away from you, that is what you're going to try to do. But I don't believe that necessarily, given certain security implications, that necessarily means the Western countries have an obligation to take very large numbers of refugees in.
Okay, we'll come back to that in just a moment. Ludovica, Bidi. I think we mentioned almost 1 million people, 900,000 there. Dadaab, the one in northern Kenya, is made up of lots of different camps, but vast numbers there, and the Kenyan government wanted to shut it down. Do these people have hope, and do they look to the outside world for that, or within the areas where they are?
I don't think these people have hope, at least in the short term. They don't think they would be able to return to their home country. When I went to Bidi, I spoke mainly with people who had just fled from South Sudan, and they were mainly children whose parents had been killed, who had nothing, and who had witnessed war. Most of them had been raped and had been forced to participate in the conflict. So what they want is just want to have a safe place where they can hope one day they can start a normal life. So
but there are groups there, aren't there, that are helping them to integrate into the local society, giving them schools for the children, giving them jobs and so on. That's better than just making them sit and wait for something better.
I think it's better because these people need to become less dependent. So they need to start building their own lives, and in order to do that, they will be able to access school, to access health services, to have a job, to start earning for themselves. Otherwise, they will never be able to have a
Ahmed,
life.
you're going to tell us your story in just a moment, if you would. But Sarah, can I ask you this one? Are we, as richer countries, and I know there are so many different countries here, honouring our obligations under international law?
Well, there's not specifically an international legal obligation to host a certain number of refugees. But if you look proportionately at the number of people who are displaced globally, the West, the richest countries in the world, are really shouldering a very tiny proportion of those. I think it's a huge misconception that the majority of refugees and displaced persons are trying to get to Europe, are trying to get to the United States. As we saw in the video...
Well, 9 out of 10 are in poorer countries.
Yes, 80 to 90% are hosted in the world's poorest countries. At the height of the European refugee crisis, we saw 1 million people spontaneously arriving at Europe's borders. Uganda is one country, and it's taking 1 million people by itself.
So there is no international law that covers this in a broad brush way. We'll get on to whether that should be the case in just a little while. But Ahmed, tell me your story. It's only 2 years since you were a refugee yourself.
Yes, I fled Aleppo to the Kurdistan region of Iraq, in northern Iraq. And then I thought that would be probably for 1 week, maybe a month, till the situation gets better in Syria. And this was late 2012. And still the war ongoing in my country. When ISIS attacked Mosul and the city fell, I fled back to Syria, then to Turkey, and had to take the perilous journey till I made it here to the
Which took you a very long time and through numerous countries. This was probably the last place you could get to without taking another journey by sea. Were you treated in the way that you would hope civilized people would treat refugees?
I mean, on a personal level, because I spoke English, so it was easier for me, to manage the things. So it was easier for me to go to the train station or bus station, to get my tickets. But again, I mean, 55 days, crossing borders, swimming, seas and rivers.
Difficult, I know, but were you treated the way that you would expect? be treated by civilized people.
Yes, yeah. I mean, my treatment here after I made it to the UK was great. I mean, I was welcomed by, British people. I was welcomed by an English family. I was hosted for them for 5 months. So, and even while I was the university, they granted me a scholarship to do my master's. So my experience was a positive one.
I do want you to sort of counter each other's arguments and not wait for me necessarily to interject on this one, but I'll come full circle to you, Jack, on this one. The suggestion from Sarah is that the richer countries are actually doing what they can to some extent, but not as much as they could.
Well, I mean, in terms of the raw numbers, obviously it's true the very large refugee camps are in less developed countries, but I would tell that to the communities in Germany and indeed the UK and France who have seen the demographics of their local community change very considerably. It's very upsetting for them. And then when you combine that with a series of terrorist attacks across the continent, it becomes...
You can't necessarily conflate the two.
You can't conflate the two, but they're coming from... There is a cultural difference between those countries in the West and a country like Syria, Iraq and Afghanistan, and Muslim-majority countries that do have views that are very different and somewhat incompatible with Western values, and that causes a conflict.
But isn't it intolerant to the host countries' people to say these people are so different we can't bring them in?
I mean, could I also say exactly the same arguments were made prior to and during the Second World War against allowing Jewish refugees trying to escape the Nazis from entering the UK and other non-occupied countries. Exactly the same arguments were made. It's going to affect our demographic, it's going to cause social upheaval, it's going to be different economically for us to host these people. Do we really want to look back in 10 or 20 years' time and think, actually, we didn't do anything because we made some kind of, half-hearted excuses about reasons that we wouldn't let these people into the country? And I think it's also really important to differentiate between someone who doesn't like having Muslim migrants in a country and someone who is unwilling to accept a responsibility to host refugees, people fleeing persecution, war.
Yeah. Sorry, one thing that I want to add is that it has happened in several instances that suspects behind terror attacks were not actually refugees, were people who were born in these countries.
But also we have seen attacks by people who were refugees, economic migrants in some cases. Not necessarily terrorist attacks, but attacks against people in particular countries. There are natural concerns.
I mean, not everyone who is coming is an angel, I mean, at the end of the day, you're talking about 1 million people. You cannot, naturally presume that 100 people, will be all angels. I'm sure there will be some people, will have, because of what has been happening in their countries, for example, for many, many years and their grievances. I'm sure there will be some of people, who will have their own grievances. But at least, look, for example, there was recently a book issued by the University of Oxford, 2 professors, Alexander Betts and Paul Collier. And they said over 50% of Syrians in a university or a treaty, university degree today, they are in Europe. For Europe, this is great news. In Germany itself, over 4,000 doctors, Syrian doctors, are today in Germany. How much money would it cost Germany, let's say, from the day that the doctor is born to the day he is graduated? How much money would it cost Germany, the German taxpayers, when they immediately, like Sunday, you wake up and you find 4,000 people in your door and they're ready.
What is the alternative, though, to either having people migrate towards your country, settle in refugee camps in their own countries or neighbouring countries? The alternative is aid. And a lot of people argue that that doesn't work. Why?
I think that any kind of solution has to have multiple strands to it. So, providing aid or development to countries or regions of origin is certainly, one way to help people in the region. But there are always going to be people that need to move on. And they are people that are going to need to be hosted in other countries. So I think there isn't really a simple catch-all answer to the question of how to solve the refugee problem.
But isn't it a bit rich, excuse the use of the word, to say to a particular country you're not doing enough to help refugees, when in fact that country is giving a great deal of money, take the United States, for example, in terms of its overseas aid budget to help people resettle within those particular areas.
I mean, and that's a huge argument that's been made, particularly within the European context. So in Europe, the way that the asylum system works is the two countries to which most arrivals, to which most people arrive, that's Greece and Italy, they have to shoulder the majority of what you would call the physical burden, right, of the refugee arrivals, okay? And other countries may provide financial support.
Such as Europe is paying Turkey to make sure that it looks after refugees in Turkey, and they are, by all accounts, being looked after extremely well there.
Well, not by all accounts, I would say.
Okay, by most accounts.
But by some accounts. But there is a very strong argument, I think, that you can't simply throw money at a problem, because one country, if you look at Lebanon, for example, 1 in 6 people in Lebanon is a refugee. It's going to be very difficult for that country to function effectively with that large number of displaced people.
Do you want to come in?
I would certainly say that the EU or Europe as a whole needs to make sure that Italy and Greece are correctly funding and dealing with the crisis, because as you made the point earlier, there is a difference, certainly a big difference, between genuine refugees and economic migrants. The problem we're having is that there have been so many coming over, and the processing centres have been so under-resourced that the distinction between the two, it's not possible to make the distinction. If those countries were able to process them properly, and you can make a decision, and you could then deport ones that you thought were dangerous or may not contribute or whatever it may be, that would go a long way to addressing maybe the security concerns.
I think you're completely right. That would go a long way, having proper processing centres. But one of the reasons...
That's an EU-wide policy, and at the moment we don't have an EU-wide policy.
We don't have an EU-wide policy, and in fact I think most of the problems surrounding the registration of people is due directly to the lack of political leadership within Europe on this issue. It's been a case of let's try and deter people, stop them arriving, and then what do? You end up with lots of spontaneous arrivals all over the place, very difficult to control, to maintain, to register, to keep track of.
Ahmed, did we do it better in the past? I'm thinking about one of the first stories I covered as a journalist was the arrival of the Ugandan Asians in this country. Then about the same time we had the Vietnamese boat people, all of which seemed to sort of be, there was a collective will to do the right thing at that point. Do you notice a change in attitude?
I think from what I've seen from media, and one of the arguments that the book that I mentioned before, Refuge, mentioned because of the nature, because many of these people are coming from Muslim, majority countries, it became an issue. And I'm sorry for being so blatant about it, because because these people are coming, from, as you mentioned before, Muslim majority countries. This could be, an issue because a lot of people feel, as a kind of a cultural invasion, that we are concerned about our values, about identity. But still, I mean, when it comes, the core issues have never changed. People still flee. If you're a Christian, if you're a Muslim, if you're a Buddhist, if you are, an atheist, you still flee because of persecution, regardless of your beliefs, of your color, whatever.
One of the biggest aid groups, Amnesty International, has come up with an 8-point plan. It says, for helping solve the problem, one of which is to allow people fleeing persecution or wars to cross borders with or without travel documents. Now, presumably that is something that would be anathema to you.
Absolutely. Well, that is the kind of...
Is that... Sorry, carry on.
Well, it's the kind of... The problem, the big backlash against the levels of immigration, migration, refugees coming to Europe has been because it's been completely uncontrolled. You have vast swathes coming in, and even though it might be relatively small to the massive refugee camps in Lebanon, in Turkey, so on, it's the uncontrolled nature of it that is causing the fear. Now, if you have...
But is it not the uncontrolled nature of the oratory of those people who want to whip up anti-refugee sentiment for their own ends, populist politicians, for example?
I mean, populist politics, yeah, but if you proceed with more uncontrolled immigration, the populist politicians are only going to get more support. And you've seen that in Germany in the recent elections, Czech Republic also elections coming up.
So are you advocating that the European states should provide legal and safe routes for refugees to access Europe?
I'm advocating you just need a controlled immigration system. You need to be able to differentiate between those who may be a threat and those who are not a threat.
And would you do that by providing legal and safe routes so that people, if they were trying to flee Syria, they could apply via a visa route or something similar to that, be vetted in a usual way, go through registration processes and arrive in Europe?
I mean, of course, I would not be against that. You can't
Does this go back to what we call the Nansen passport, which was something in the early part of the 20th century where people as a refugee were given travel documents? Is that what?
Sort of.
Come in and say.
Sort of. I mean, the Nansen passport, it was a really important development of the 1920s, which essentially it gave refugees identity documents, a means to travel around, and some form of legal status in a way.
50 plus countries recognised.
It's really, really important. Nowadays, well, for the past sort of 2 or 3 decades, what states have been doing is they've been making it increasingly difficult for people to actually leave their countries of origin or their regions of origin. So we have, you know, visa restrictions are placed immediately on any countries that have conflict or large numbers of displaced persons coming out of it.
Yeah.
We have carrier sanctions that are placed on, you know, travel providers, bringing anyone that's undocumented or doesn't have the right visa into the country. So it's becoming increasingly difficult for people to actually get out of the countries or regions that they're in. And the big push of European states at the moment is to do deals with a lot of countries in North Africa and the Middle East with really dubious human rights records, such as Libya. Yes. And the whole purpose is containment.
Yeah, until we stop elements like human trafficking, which is happening through parts of Africa in particular, yes. And Libya. The problem's not going to go away, therefore any kind of solution to the problem's not going to go away.
No, of course, and we've also seen, you know, a rise in so-called detention centers in Libya, where in reality all human rights groups have proven that these places are actually places where people are tortured and kept against their will. So, you know, it's just a cycle of human rights abuses.
Yeah. Jay, I know you wanted to say something, but let me put this to you. I mean, in overall terms, the numbers coming into Europe are relatively small, considering it is a global problem. Your suggestion was that if we had means of sifting through those people who wanted to take refuge, then we could sort out the problem. Would that mean there should be an unlimited number of people, as long as they're deemed to be okay and not a security risk?
Well, the problem with the hypothetical that you gave is that it assumes there is a process that could be perfect. Could be a perfect vetting process, and that the European Union would indeed be able to muster the will and coordination to do something like that, which I think is extremely doubtful. In terms of numbers,
the richest countries have the means to put this sort of system in place to test.
Well, in theory, they have the financial means. Whether they have the political ability or the political will, given the divided nature of Europe.
They have resettlement policies in place at the moment already that do very stringent vetting of a certain number of people that come from certain countries in the world.
With due respect to the guests to my right, you managed to get through how many different countries without being properly vetted?
10 countries.
You see?
Yes, but when we're talking here about spontaneous arrival, there are processes under the UN Refugee Agency system, resettlement. So a certain few number of people each year get resettled in each country. That's what President Trump has lowered the numbers of.
So now at the head of the United Nations, we have a man who used to be in charge of the UN Council for Refugees, Antonio Guterres. Is he going to make any changes that make things better?
Well, there is a process in place at the United Nations level at the moment. It was initiated in September last year, September 2016, a big General Assembly summit. And they put in place what are known as the Global Compacts. And the idea is that this is a 2-year process leading towards... We're going to have to wait to see what the true outcome of this is. But the idea is to have greater international cooperation to deal with the refugee crisis and to have frameworks in place so that essentially when a crisis materialises, states know what their role is.
Brief word from you two, and then I want to get last word from Ahmed, who's been in this situation. Do you think the international effort is there through initiatives such as the one Sarah describes?
No, I don't think the international effort is there. I don't think there is a lack of will from countries, I mean, really big countries like China and Russia, to really take on their share of the burden. The focus is on the West, and especially with Trump's disdaining attitude towards it, the focus is far too much on Europe to do everything.
But I think there's also a lack of will among countries within the European Union. Like, I mean, there are countries who are unwilling to take any refugees. So I think we have to look at also at what the European Union is doing now, and I don't think it's doing enough.
Ahmed, it's not so very long ago that you were waking up in a refugee camp. Presumably you know a lot of people who are still in that situation. Maybe you still have family members there. What does the future hold for them, those people you know?
Take, for example, the Syrian situation, a country before the conflict which had 22 million people. Today, over 500,000 people lost their lives. You know, over 7 million people are internally displaced. Over 5 million people are taking refuge in the neighboring countries.
On a personal level?
On a personal level. I mean, on a personal level, these people never, ever wanted to leave their homes. You know, the majority of these people today are living in refugee camps, hoping that one day soon they could go back to their families, to their loved ones, to their homes, to their memories, you know, to their roots. No one wanted to come to Europe. And a very tiny number of Syrians made it to Europe. They do not want to come to Europe. Yeah. They want to go back to their homes, to their loved ones.
And you want to go back as what?
As a Syrian who, last week, I submitted my dissertation in violence, conflict and development. I'm hoping to go back to do something to rebuild my country, hopefully when the conflict comes to an end.
Thank you. Thank you all very much indeed for joining us on Roundtables. It is all about sharing or shirking responsibilities with this refugee crisis. The numbers of people displaced, well, it doesn't look like it's going to fall at the moment. It is going to rise, probably it's going to get worse. So the question been asking, do richest governments need to rethink what they're doing so as not to leave behind the millions and millions of men, women and children with nowhere that they can really call home? Thanks for watching. I'm David Foster. This has been Roundtable. See you next time, I hope. For now, bye-bye.